Hello, my name is Ron Beaver, and I've taught here at Oklahoma Christian University for 32 years, from 1964 to 1996. I taught communication classes as well as homiletic courses. I also taught a course for about 20 years called the Restoration Movement. I wrote my doctor's dissertation at Northwestern University in 1968, and it was on the early speaking in the early Restoration Movement from 1820 to 1849. I spent 3 summers looking at old church record books in churches in Kentucky and Ohio and Tennessee, and as a kind of basis for my research, for my dissertation. And during that time, I accumulated a lot of books, as my wife would probably testify, dealing with the Restoration Movement in northeastern part of the United States. And this movement was called the Christian Connexion movement. And recently I gave some 20 books, periodicals, and hymn books to the Restoration Library here at OC, dealing with the Restoration Movement in the northeastern part of the United States. And those books and periodicals and hymn books, I believe, comprise one of the best collection of material on this movement to be found anywhere in any library here in the United States. And the purpose of this presentation is to describe the books for the benefit of future researchers. And I don't have time during this presentation to describe the whole Christian Connexion movement and how it fits into other restoration movements of the time. And this is going to be covered in a PowerPoint slides which goes along with this presentation. The early restoration movement here in New England was mainly due to the efforts of 2 people, 2 men, Elias Smith and Abner Jones. About the year 1802, both of these men, about the same time, independently of each other, discovered after reading the New Testament that they should just be Christians and Christians only. And they read in Acts 11:26 that the early church people were called Christians. Elias Smith wrote in his autobiography, which is a very interesting book. I gave the library the first edition of that, which was published in 1816. But in that, on page 298, he says, "In the spring of 1802, having rejected the doctrine of Calvin and universalism to search the scriptures to find the truth, I found the name which was the following that Christians ought to wear, which was Christians, Acts 11:26. He goes and says, "I ventured for the first time softly to tell the people that the name Christian was enough for the followers of Christ without the addition of the word Baptist or Methodist, etc." So, he was really searching for the right church and for the right name to call themselves. And it's interesting that in 1803, Abner Jones, who was preaching in Vermont, met Elias Smith in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and found they had a lot in common. And Smith called him in his biography, he says, "the first free man that I ever met." So both these men separated themselves from the Baptist church, which they were connected with at that time, and traveled separately and started preaching all over Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Maine. And they both wanted to preach the good news of Christ, take the Bible only as their only guide, become Christians and Christians only, call Bible names by what they found in the Bible. And so wherever they went and they established churches, they were usually called Christian churches. Sometimes they were called the name Church of Christ. But baptism was by immersion. They really believed that strongly. And they both still clung, however, to the Baptist belief, kind of a remnant of Calvinism, that it was not necessary for salvation. And somehow or another, they believed that God just somehow or another, through some experimental religious experience, would touch your heart and you'd be saved, and then you'd be baptized later. And that was pretty much what they taught. So much of their preaching was very emotional to get the people all excited so that they might be elected by God to be Christians, which is kind of a strange doctrine today. But anyway, Elias Smith preached and wrote really strong against the clergy class. And throughout much of his life, Smith invited conflict with the clergy who were wearing, as he called them, black suits and making money from their preaching and using biblical terms not found in the Bible. And he traveled throughout New England, establishing many congregations. Abner Jones, on the other hand, avoided conflict. He's a very peaceful man. He spent some 40 years preaching and planting and nurturing many churches there in New England. And in 1805, Smith began writing a magazine which he called the Christian Magazine, which he published for every 3 months for 2 years. And in this magazine, and incidentally, this is a reprint of that. I couldn't find the original one that came out in those early years. But anyway, he reviewed the sermons of the day and then showed how that they were unscriptural, using unbiblical terms and things that were not in the Bible. But significantly, on September the 1st, 1808, Elias Smith published the first number of the Herald of Gospel Liberty in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And in this publication, he calls it, "A religious newspaper is almost a new thing under the sun. I know not, but this is the first ever published in the world." There were 274 copies of this publication, and by September of 1815, 7 years later, there were about 1,500 subscribers to this publication. This is a picture of the first page of that. I found this rare copy of the Herald of Gospel Liberty in an out-of-print book shop about 40 years ago. It was in a catalog that I got at the time. So I immediately called the book dealer and was very pleased to be able to purchase this. To find a bound copy of this publication is extremely rare, especially since there's only 274 copies of this newspaper published in 1808. And for someone to accumulate all those issues and then go to the trouble of binding them together is very rare. There, at least as I've been able to find, there's just a few single issues of this paper in a few libraries around the country, but OC is the only library that I'm aware of that has all the issues of all the first years bound together. It's probably the most prized possession of any library in Oklahoma. To have a bound copy of the first 4 years of the first religious newspaper in America is something very special. And the name on the front of this publication is called Henry Plummer. And as I looked a bit later, he was one of the first subscribers of this publication. And to find him that he kept all these issues and then bound them together is extremely rare. Smith was largely a reformer, and in this paper is filled with articles, I think at least 40 of them, titled Religious Liberty. And he's wanting to find in religion the liberty to believe what the Bible taught and only believe that, and to have a Reformation movement that was similar to the political Reformation that was going on at that time in the Declaration of Independence, and to have that in the religious movement. So this particular publication is extremely important because it did unite the fellowship of the Christian churches, or Churches of Christ as sometimes they're called, up there in the Northeast. And it also brought the three Christian Connection movements, one that was down in the South, which later on was called the Southern Christian Movement, and the one in the West, which is in Ohio, the Stone Movement, and also the one up there in New England, all together. So it was a unifying force that had a tremendous impact on the brotherhood as as a whole. And I found this publication also to be filled with news about the Christian Connection. Sometimes they're called the New Light movement, and they were all over that part of the country. In 1812, Smith said that he had subscribers from every state of the Union except one that was subscribing to this publication, the Herald of Gospel Liberty. Smith published this newspaper every other week until October of 1817, when he revealed for the first time that he had changed his religious beliefs and now had become a Universalist. And by that announcement, Smith's influence among the Christian churches in the Northeast and elsewhere was largely destroyed. The best book on the history of the Herald of Gospel Liberty is this book by Barrett called The Centennial of Religious Journalism. And this is the first edition. I've given this to the library, but it traces the history of the Herald of Gospel Liberty for 100 years. Yes, it was called something different a little bit later, but anyway, that's a significant book also to have. Now, in 1812, Smith published a book called New Testament Dictionary, and this is a significant book. In that book, he defines 1,092 words in the New Testament, which is in this 392-page book. And the purpose of this was to let people know what the words in the New Testament mean, so that they were not using words that were not found in the New Testament, like Trinity or purgatory and things like that. So he spent about 6 months writing this, and in this book, he defines words as they were used in the New Testament, and this had a lot of impact on people at that time, to call biblical things by biblical names, and he thought it would go a long way to bring religious liberty. And it's rare to find a first edition of this in existence. I don't know of any other library that has that. And I can't help but believe that Alexander Campbell used that a lot in his study. The best description of Elias Smith, in his own words, was published in 1816, and that's the book I quoted to just a while ago. And it's kind of rare, it is rare to find a first edition of this book. It's been republished, obviously, but I gave this to the library. And this is a history of Elias Smith's life up until 1816, and it's extremely interesting to read because he talks about him being very poor, not being able to go to school. He had to learn how to read and write on his own, and yet this man was able to publish probably more religious books and periodicals than about anybody at its time. And at the end of this book, it has a list of all the publications that, or at least a lot of it that was written at that time, was still available. In 1823, Smith publicly denounced universalism, and in 1827, he started a publication called The Morning Star and City Watchman. Hardly any library has copies of this publication, but I was able to find 8 issues of this periodical, volumes 1 and 2, 1827, 1828, loosely bound together, and these are now in the OC Restoration Library. Smith was also liked to prophesy a lot, and so he wrote a book, Sermons Containing the Illustration of Prophecies, which also giving the library. This is a reprint edition of that. But anyway, these are some of the books that Smith wrote. And also he collected hymns and put them together. And this is the first edition of that, called A Collection of Hymns for the Use of Christians. And this was 1805, I recall. And then later on in that movement, the Christian Connection movement, there was a man by the name of Robert Foster who put out this book called Hymns Original and Selected for the Use of Christians, 1826. And I don't know any library that has this publication either. This is the first edition of this first general hymn book that was used among the Christians up in New England. And it's kind of interesting as I looked through this book that there's on page 198 is a hymn called The New Light. And he says, "Come all who are new lights indeed, who are from sin and bondage freed," and goes ahead and talks about such as the new lights. And so it's a hymn just connected with that particular movement. But this booklet, of course, has no music to it, it's all words, but it's a very good hymn book. Many of them are Watts hymns, and many of these hymns, I just pick a few of these out that we're still seeing today that's in that book. Now, a little bit later, and this came out in 1856, a songbook that was more, it even had more hymns in it, 1854, called the Christian Hymn Book, Psalms, Hymns, and Spiritual Songs. And this is the third edition of that, but this is a rare copy also that I've given the library. And here again, these are rich hymns, great hymns, many of them Watts hymn from England, and others that they picked out with special attention. And I really enjoyed looking at that book over the years. As I was mentioning, this book that came out in 1854 called The Christian Hymns indicates that by this time the Christian Connexion movement had largely become a denomination, much like other denominations of the time. Preachers in the movement were now being called reverend. The publication had been, center had been moved to Dayton, Ohio. And so it's unfortunate in a way that the original purpose of that, to become Christians and Christians only, and not go by denominational names, by the second generation, that had not been followed. And so I'm going to be giving the library also other books about the movement on that second generation. But before I go there, I want to just tell you some other books I have about Abner Jones. Unfortunately, I was not able to find the first edition of Abner Jones, which is a memoir by his son that was put out in 1842, I believe it was. But anyway, I do have the copy of that, and then also there's other books I have of Abner Jones that are reprints. But by the second generation, we have men like memoirs of men like Elijah Shaw, who wrote this, his biography. This is a very interesting book because it talks a little bit about his wanting just to be called elder and not be called reverend, but also about trying to go back to the New Testament, but finding a problem of the preachers of that time. So the second generation got away from the original purpose of the group, and this is the life of Millard, Life and Writings, which is the second generation of the Christian Connexion movement. And then this book, Life and Writings of Somervell, this book is a book that a lot of it is written against the Campbell movement and against baptism being necessary for salvation. And but these are all books talking about some of the debates of the time, especially the debate about Unitarianism, which that movement did gravitate toward. And that was one of the reasons why Campbell was very reluctant to kind of merge with that church, because they had become pretty much a denomination, and they did believe in experimental religion of the heart, being saved through some religious experience, and also the fact that they did tend toward Unitarianism. I also have given the library a number of other books related to the Northeastern Christian Connection movement. And one of these is by Burnett called Elias Smith, and another one by Burnett, same fella, on Abner Jones. And this one here is a general one dealing with the Christian Connection movement. He calls it a denomination now. And then this book by Kernodle is one that lists a brief biography of all the preachers up in New England, as well as the preachers down in the southern part, called the Southern Christian Connection movement. Incidentally, that Southern Christian Connection movement was started by O'Kelly, is housed, most of the books is in the Elon University Library there in North Carolina, if you want to do research on that part of the movement. Now, I found this interesting book, which is the first edition of a book. It's a book called Christian Union, an argument for the abolition of sex, by Abraham Van Dyke. And he's not connected, as far as I know, with any movement, but he writes here the necessity of calling yourselves Christians and Christians only, and giving up denominational names. So I'm giving that book to the library. In addition, I want to just highly recommend a book here by James Gardner. It's called The Christians of New England. And he did a lot of research on that. He was a missionary of the Churches of Christ up in New England for 7 or 8 years. And he did a lot of research on that movement. And he taught at Freed-Hardeman College for a while. But it's an excellent book on going into detail about the Christians of New England.